Hey guys, welcome back to the Green Room. We are on episode 21, and we're going to try to finish up with our Romans chapter 7, verses 1 through 13. Let me do a quick recap. We talked about the reason we're set free from the law, then the results of being set free from law, and that's what we finished last week. We had talked about previously a new freedom, a new relationship, a new purpose, and then finally last week we talked about a new motivation. And my all-time favorite, we got to talk about Mr. Law is dead. Ding dong, the law is dead. Wicked law, wicked law. And then we said, hey, now she can get remarried. So she remarries
Mr. Grace.
Mr. Grace. Mr. Grace steps in, and he is so hot. He is the greatest husband ever. But it doesn't mean that all the rules go out the window. That's the interesting part, because there are still things that are right and things that are wrong. The difference all boils down to the motivation behind why we do what we do. And so it's not as though if you come to Christ, you live a life of grace, you just live however you want. You can do whatever you want. You can sin as much as you want. It changes your motivation and desire of what you want to do to please that new spouse. And so from there, we asked the question, well then, what good is the law?
Right.
What good is the law? We started kind of clarifying, the distinctives, so do we just throw the law out? And what was the conclusion?
Yeah, and we said, well, do these commandments that we find in the Old Testament, this law, does it still apply to me even? And we said, well, okay, yes and no is where we landed on it. We said two big things changed. Two big things changed in this. One, this idea of having a covenant nation that was uniquely positioned before God, that was like going to be the one who all these rules applied to, well, that's gone now. And then the other thing is the temple is replaced. And so we see a lot of the laws were around what makes Israel special, what are things that are going to set them apart from the rest of the world. And so that's why we see like food laws and kosher eating and things like that. But they said that doesn't apply to us now. So we're not them, and that kind of stuff isn't needed anymore. And then the temple being replaced, we talked about that as well. This idea of the curtain being torn in two, granted access to God in the Holy of Holies by virtue of the Holy Spirit living in us now, rather than having to do sacrifices and follow all these rules to get there. And we said, no, those are the two pieces that go away. But certainly the heart behind many of the commandments are still there. Like, it's still wrong to kill people, right? It's still wrong to commit adultery. And so the law still, in fact, serves lots and lots of purposes for us, even today as Christians. So what's a couple of them? I'll give you a couple of them. One is...
Yeah, let's go into that.
Yeah, it defines what sin is. It defines for us what sin actually is. If you look at Romans 7:7, it says, well then, am I suggesting that the law of God is sinful? Of course not. In fact, it was the law that showed me my sin. I would have never known that coveting is wrong if the law had not said, you must not covet. So he's saying, look, it's not like it just all gets thrown out and it's bad. Actually, it's still good. It still shows me, okay, this is covetousness and that's bad. You shouldn't do that. So it sets these boundaries there to protect us. Just like we have boundaries for helping us stay on the road with speed limits and stop signs. The idea is, okay, we follow these rules because it keeps us safe on the road. The same thing applies to these rules that God has given us in the Bible. It's saying, hey, I want what's best for you. And hey, I actually made you and designed you, so I kind of know what's going to help you be successful in life. And so let's put some laws around that. And so it says we couldn't know what we needed to move away from or what we needed to move towards without having this kind of law to show us, okay, this is definitely one of those boundaries. And then
let me, that's an important concept. And the reason that's important is because how many people are a little afraid to surrender their life to Christ because they're afraid that God is all about this, you can't, and they're thinking, that God's laws are all prohibitive. They're all this sense of like, man, why was God so uptight all the time?
Right.
And he's a killjoy, and he's constantly trying to lay all these rules and laws, and he's really just trying to, keep us from having a lot of fun. And the concept of boundaries and stop signs and guardrails and things that are actually protecting us.
Yep.
It's pretty important.
It's pretty
and when you
huge.
look at the Ten Commandments, even in and of themselves, all of these are given for our good.
Yep.
They're not given as saying prohibitive. I don't want you to have all the fun of murdering people.
Yeah.
I mean, it's really for our own protection, for our own good.
Right. When we think about, okay, just who God is and how much he knows, and how much he loves us, we don't even know what the best possible thing for ourselves is. But God does. And the only way we get to experience that best is by allowing the boundaries that he puts in place to guide our life to it. And so I actually shared this concept with our high schoolers at Equip from 5 to 7 p.m. on Wednesday nights. So if you're a high schooler or you got a high schooler in your family, you need to get them there because we're covering awesome stuff like this of, okay, how do we set God's boundaries in our life so we get to experience his best for us? And so that's what the law does still. Okay. God uses it to show us those boundaries, not to keep us from doing good things and keep us from having fun, but to direct us and help us land where the best possible place that only he knows.
Yeah, if he puts up a sign that says bridge is out,
Don't cry.
It's for our own protection.
Yeah,
it's because you could die.
Yep.
And so God's trying to help us.
Yep. And then the next thing that the law does is it awakens sin. It awakens sin in us. Check this out in Romans 7, verses 8 and 9. It says, but sin used this command to arouse all kinds of covetous desires within me. If there is no law, sin would not have that power. One time I lived without understanding the law, but when I learned the command, do not covet, for instance, the power of sin came into my life. And so it's kind of like that. I was thinking, what is Paul saying? It's like you walk into the place and there's this sign that says, don't do this, this, this. And it's like, I would have never imagined to do any of those things on the list. But thank you very much, because now I know for a fact one of my kids is doing these things.
That's right.
Right? And so the law awakens this sin that's in us. At the moment, the moment you tell somebody not to do something, for a fact, eventually they're going to get around to doing that thing.
It kind of feels like the Jumanji principle.
Yeah, right.
It's like, don't spin that,
Yeah.
but you do, know you're going to do it. But when you do, it opens up this Pandora's box of all kinds of nasty consequences.
The big red button that says don't press the button, right? And all those cartoons I grew up with.
That's right.
And we need to think about this because it works the same way in our lives. If we try to break a habit, and the whole time we're trying to break the habit, we say, I don't do that. I don't want to do that. I don't want to do that. Well, eventually we do the thing. I've tried to tell myself not to eat the glazed chocolate donut 1,000 times. I'm going to eat the donut. Might take me an extra half hour to get to it, but I'm having that conversation. Same thing with like training your kids. If you're thinking about your kids and you're like, okay, I wish I could get them to have better skills. Like, okay, what if we could just not wreck the house? What if we could not track mud through the house? Instead of saying, hey, don't track mud through the house, what if we rephrase that to a positive thing that said, hey, we wipe our feet off when we come in the door. Let's make a habit of we wipe our feet.
Yeah, so leaning into this principle that because the nature of sin is rebellion.
Yeah.
And don't tell me what to do.
Yeah.
So, the parenting tip there is just leaning into the fact that we are raising little sinners.
Yeah.
I mean, they pop out of the womb as little sinners.
Yeah.
And so we are raising that. And because we're leaning into that, you're taking advantage of that to be a smarter parent.
Yep.
That's good stuff.
Yep.
One of the things I want to point out in what you just said is that you could easily mistake this passage as saying that the law made us sinners.
Yeah.
But that's actually not what it's saying. It's saying that it awakened the principle of sin, but the reality of sin was already there. So that's why he gives the one example in the covetousness trips the wire for covetousness when it says don't covet. But the desire for me to do what was wrong was already there.
Yeah.
So it's important, again, to have that distinction between big S sin and little s sin. The big S, of the sense of we were born with the nature of sin versus the manifestation, the outcropping of sin, these actions from sin.
Yeah.
So those are some important principles. Let's go on to number 3, verses 10 and 11. He says, and so I died. I discovered that the law's commands, which were supposed to bring life, brought spiritual death. Sin took advantage of those commands and deceived me. It used the command to kill me. So he's saying, once I tripped over this wire, it took advantage because all roads of sin lead to death. James says the same thing. He says that when that temptation begins in its seed kernel form, it always reaps a harvest of death. It's always going to land there. He says sin took advantage of that and actually became the ultimate result of that is I became dead. I became spiritually dead. And one of the principles that Paul is bringing out here is pretty important to understand. And it's this principle. You cannot legislate. You cannot legislate a new life by making new laws. So this idea that somehow I can create laws that would make someone be a better person is ludicrous. And I want to talk on this for just a moment, because we are changing culturally, and we're moving into a brand new domain, I believe, of cultural philosophy around mandating how people feel rather than what people do. So when you create laws, specifically laws around things that are toxic poisons of the heart, like racism, you can create legislation that says, hey man, you are not going to discriminate on who you're going to serve as a customer. That's immoral, it's wrong, and we can legislate that all day long, and we should. But if you try to legislate and said, and don't even feel it or think it, you've entered a new domain. You're trying to create a legislation for transformation. That does not work. The only way you can actually change someone from being a racist is to actually transform their heart.
Yeah.
And Paul's talking about this important principle, the difference between, legislation and creating laws. For example, every year in the United States, we have more laws. Question, are we better? Laws do not make better people. Only Jesus can do that. So that's an important principle that Paul brings out. And here's number 4 in verse 12. He says, but still, the law itself and its commands are holy and right and good. So it's demonstration. This is my big one that we cover in the Bible overview. And really, I double down on this idea, is that the law always, in all sections of the law, even those laws that we would consider fulfilled, outdated, or transition into the new covenant, all laws demonstrate the character of God's heart, who God is. So this key word here is holy. And in both the Old Testament and New Testament, holiness is often misunderstood by many Christians. They think something that is holy is something that is pure. And that's not actually what the word means. To be holy doesn't mean pure. It means to be set apart. It means to be completely removed one from the other. And that's why God is ultimately holy, because He is ultimately and completely set apart and unique and different than us. So that's why we can't trust our own opinions for right and wrong. And this is really, really important. I can't tell you how many pastoral counseling appointments I've had where someone has been hurt over when I share a passage, whether it's on homosexuality or LGBTQ, or talking about the issues that are so prevalent in our society right now, and they'll come and in tears and in hurt and pain think that what I'm doing is trying to be hurtful towards a certain set of people, and it's difficult for us to grasp this concept that it's not about how I feel. It's about what's true.
When you ask the question, what's true, there's two groups. You have the groups that believe God defines what's true, and then you have the group that really says either me and you do or nobody can, so we just kind of have to agree on it ourselves and make it up as we go along. And when at that level, truth is different, there's almost no ability for voice in between the two anymore. It makes it almost impossible to have a real conversation based on I'm right and you're wrong.
Well, and those arguments boil down to one of two categories. Truth is either objective or subjective. If it's subjective, then the fact is, next generation, it could be okay for me to murder you. Because if the crowd all agrees, anything goes. And in fact, we don't have to theorize and say, oh, that's just theoretical. We watched it in Nazi Germany in World War II. Now, we use World War II a lot, and the poor Nazis, that's the only evil. Guys, this happens today. Like today, in the world today, governments decide people groups that should be wholesale slaughtered, and groups of people who decide themselves together a subjective standard of moral relativism, and that can change. So if the truth can change for me, the truth can change for you, And there's only one truth, and it's objective truth. I mean, it's easy for us to take this straight into the science of mathematics or something. I mean, we know how clearly idiotic it would be to say, let's all agree together by vote
Yeah, right.
that 2 and 2 is 5,
Right.
and we'll just all vote on that for the rest of our life. We know that you can't operate a society with that kind of, yet we're trying to do the same thing with moral truth. So what do you think about that?
Oh, I mean, I think that this is one of the biggest problems facing our cultures today. I think that we have generations who've been brought up under this idea of you're crazy if you think there's an absolute truth, and they're butting heads with the older generations who have always had a foundation of. And so, for one group, the one that has the foundation, this doesn't make any sense. I don't even know how to relate to you. You're absolutely crazy. And on the other side, the younger generations look up and saying, you are the most intolerant, unloving people we've ever heard of, because they've been taught that to disagree is unloving. And so it breaks everything down. And
Yeah,
so,
if you're a Christian, you only get one of two options. You either accept that this book is true and what God said is true, and this becomes the objective truth to which I align my life, not he aligns his truth to my thoughts and feelings. Or the other thing, and I see a lot of Christians doing this one, sorry, but I got to say it. The only other option is if you say you're a Christian, the only other option is you either align to this or you're a hypocrite. Because I do know a lot of Christians will say, oh no, I believe the Bible, but it's still okay for people to live together. And it's still okay for me not to tithe. It's still okay for people to, be transgender. And it's still okay for people, and just, shoot the moon.
Yeah.
It's whatever. Because I'm basing my Christian, not my theology, but my actual practice, basically on my feelings.
and that actually is negating how bad sin actually is. Right? It says, and that actually is our next point here, is that the law shows us how bad sin actually is.
Well, let's do it. Verse
Yeah.
13. But how can that be? Did the law, which is good, cause my death? Of course not. Sin used what was good to bring about my condemnation to death. Notice that it was good. The law is good. So we can see how terrible sin really is. It uses God's good commands for its own evil purposes. The law is, in fact, kind of like that black light we used in the 70s. I thought things were great in my room until, I put on some Led Zeppelin and turned on the black light, and all of a sudden it's like, there's little white things all over me, and everything is covered in this stuff because suddenly it is exposing and showing what I didn't know was there, but truly was there. And that's what the law does. It exposes and opens.
Rule against black lights. No black lights allowed in my house. 4 boys. Yes.
So we've given you a lot to chew on in this session talking about, Paul starts this out, but here's what he's doing. He's doing this huge setup because he's saying, okay, let's talk about the law, but then let's talk about what the predicament the law left us in the Old Testament. And that's where he's going to pick up in these final verses and say, this is the outcropping of what it does. It basically wrecks us to lead us to a decision of saying, but for the grace of God, all of us are hopelessly lost. I hope you've enjoyed the session. At least we've given you some things to chew on or perhaps argue about.
Yeah.
So have a great small group, guys. We'll see you next time.